The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Annelise Orleck takes us inside the global uprising against poverty wages, the grassroots labor movement for Medicare-for-All, plus Bill Press with former Trump aide turned critic Anthony Scaramucci. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you could join us. Annelise Orleck is a longtime historian of labor movements. In this encore interview, she talks about her newest book and tracking the growing fight across the globe for workers' rights and a living wage. And we say hello to Annelise Orleck, who's a professor of history at Dartmouth College and the author most recently of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise Orleck, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Your book is a remarkable account of low-wage workers across the globe. How did you do your research?
I did my research in all kinds of ways. Interestingly, one of the ways that I found people was the same way that this new movement has found each other, and that is social media. I began to look for references about strikes and uprisings and new kinds of protests as part of this rising global labor movement. And I Facebooked people, I texted them, I Twittered and reached out all of those ways. And in so doing was able to make contact with people from South Africa to Baja California to Providence, Rhode Island. After that, we traveled around the world. I traveled with photographer Elizabeth Cook, who did original photographs for this project, and we did interviews in union halls. We did them in the midst of protests in the streets. We did them in faded old colonial hotels. We interviewed people by phone, by Skype, in person, and in many, many languages. And, we traveled on planes and buses, but also in open-air tuk-tuks in Asia on the backs of motorcycles. It was a pretty adventurous research process.
Wow. That actually sounds like a lot of fun on top of everything else, just to have that type of experience. And across this expansive stretch of experience, what kind of similarities did you see in the way that low-income work affects people's lives?
Well, one thing that became clear is that there have been some larger changes that have happened as a result of neoliberal capitalism in the last 30, 40 years. So here are the issues. Everywhere I went, people were protesting what they called contractualization, or what we call the gig economy. And what that means is that nobody's an employee anymore. Everybody's a contract worker. We are all fast food workers. What does that mean? 100 years ago and into the middle of the 20th century, most countries passed labor laws protecting workers, maximum hours, overtime pay, safety standards. By making everybody an independent contractor instead of an employee, corporations have done kind of an end run around labor protections for workers. So that's one thing. They're having to fight to win back the rights that workers fought for and won in the early 20th century. The next thing is that there's a real fight against the abuse of workers on the shop floor. Most low-wage workers are women, and so everywhere I went, they were fighting sexual violence in the workplace, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination. They were fighting for wage equity between male and female workers. So, there's that piece of it that to a large degree, although by no means exclusively, this has been a women's movement. And, finally, there's a real race to the bottom. What global capitalism means is that, for example, workers in Cambodia told me they were constantly threatened with the factories just picking up and leaving and moving to Bangladesh, right? They said employers would say, if you insist on higher wages, we'll just, close up shop and move someplace else where it's cheaper. And interestingly, now that Bangladeshi workers have been organizing so effectively since 2010, and they've raised their wages by many times, and they've been able to get hundreds of global corporations to agree to something called the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, which mandates factory safety inspections and mandates that the global brands actually make repairs on the factories where they make their clothing. Since that time, we've gotten, this expansion even further. And so, there have been recent reports on how Ethiopia has become, the new fast fashion engine, because there are not the kinds of labor protections there that there are other places, but they're organizing there too. And finally, the one other thing that's really unites workers worldwide is they work for the same corporations. So, many of these workers, garment workers around the world are all making clothes for H&M, for Walmart, for Gap, for Zara. And, as far as fast food workers, McDonald's is the second largest private employer in the world. Walmart is the first, right? And so they've begun to organize together with workers who work for the same global corporations, because they realize that the only way to make a difference, to be felt, when you protest against such global behemoths, is to organize transnationally, and that's exactly what they've been doing.
Interesting. And of course, the thread that holds this together in your book is the impact of global capitalism. What did you learn that you didn't already know about global capitalism in writing this book?
Well, one of the things that really struck me is, I've been politically observant all my life, and I'm a political historian. It's what I do for a living. And yet I was really struck by the extent to which these changes took place in my adult life, and I missed them, right? I did not see it. And so I think one of the things that really struck me is that we've had the emergence of these global corporations and global supply chains that are so complicated that one of the first things workers have to do when they organize is figure out who they're working for, because they know they're not really working for the farmer in whose fields they labor, or the garment factory owner in whose shop they make hundreds of shirts or pairs of sneakers or jeans in a day. Who they're really working for are the global brands, and the global brands intentionally make their supply chains complicated so that it's really difficult to trace who has the real power in these global supply chains. That's intentional, and also so they have plausible deniability. So Kalpana Akhtar, who's the leader of the Bangladesh garment workers movement, has talked about having to go in after factory fires in Dhaka and literally put her fingers in the still hot rubble and find invoices and labels so that she can then go to a Walmart or a Children's Place in the United States and say, you were there, because these corporations deny it. Of course they deny it. They don't want to have to pay reparations. They don't want to be sued. And so that's been, for me, really a surprise, is how much this process has been about making the invisible visible. For hotels, it's the same thing, right? We think of all these global hotel chains as being run, by one corporation, but in fact, hotel chains have become this site for equity investment firms. Capital goes in and out, and the people who really run them are these hotel management firms. And, the people who clean hotel rooms are maybe the most invisible of all workers, right? We all imagine, as organizer Massimo Frattini in Geneva said to me, we all imagine that we leave the hotel room and a ferry comes in and makes it beautiful again by the time we come back that evening. Of course, it's real people. It's very, very hard on people's bodies. And so they've really worked to make themselves visible, and including some very creative kinds of protests. For example, a bed-making demonstration in Harvard Square when the workers of the Doubletree Harvard Square were trying to organize, and they wanted to get, people in the college to pay attention to them. They had to come out of the rooms, out of the hotels, into the street, and literally help people try to make beds the way they have to make, 20 30 beds a day so that people could see how punishing it is on their bodies. So I think this making the invisible visible has been really important. The field workers who pick tomatoes are currently fasting in front of the United Nations in New York because, they're trying to bring attention to sexual harassment and sexual violence in the fields. So again and again, these low-wage workers have had to fight their own invisibility, and that is really surprising and moving to me.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, another link you find across the globe is that of resistance. You touched on a little bit of it right there. You write about small successes that can be models for change. So what are some of those small successes that we need to know about?
Well, there are three things going on right now that I think are really important. The first is that out of the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is one of the most creative progressive think tanks in the country, came a new organization called Jobs to Move America. And the idea was that you can take advantage of procurement budgets that cities have because cities spend a lot of money on things like mass transport, buses, trains, trucks. And so this organization has forged agreements with Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, and in so doing have brought unionized heavy manufacturing back to those cities. And what they were able to negotiate is that the cities would agree, the city departments of transportation would agree to enforce in the contract bids, to give the contract bids to companies that agreed to A, make a sizable percentage, produce a sizable percentage of the trains, buses, trucks, in the city or right near the city, B, that they would be produced in an environmentally sensitive way and would be environmentally cutting-edge vehicles, and third, that they would be union jobs, and fourth, and that the unions would train workers for those jobs. Fourth, the people who would be trained would often be people who had really big obstacles in the way of their employment. So, women of color, former vets, former cons, people who have a really hard time finding work. And so it's very exciting. You've got trains being made on the south side of Chicago again. You've got really depressed areas outside of LA where electric trucks are being made. And they're being made through these kinds of contracts. So that's one model that I think is really important because there was so much rhetoric in the 2016 campaign about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, to cities in the U.S. This progressive organization in Los Angeles is doing it, and they're doing it in really positive, environmentally friendly ways, gender equitable ways. I think that's a very exciting model. Here are a couple of others. The Villa Altagracia project makes logo wear clothing for 800 colleges and universities in the United States. This was a town in the Dominican Republic where there were these garment factories owned by foreign capital, in that case, Korean, I believe. And the workers had been trying to unionize for years, and they traveled to the United States. They made common cause with United Students Against Sweatshops, and consumers supported them, and eventually they were allowed to organize, to unionize. But then, as so often has happened in this new system, global capital fled, and the factory shut down, the town withered. Well, this guy, Phil Knight of Knight's Apparel, which makes uniforms for the National Hockey League, had a lot of tragedies in his family, and he said it made him come up and think about himself and what he is doing with his life besides making money. And he decided to open up a test project called the Villa Altagracia Project. And these are factories, garment factories with union jobs. Workers have health care. They're now people who are living in huts are living in houses with running water and electricity. Their kids get help trying to go to college. And this corporate, this responsible corporation is now, they partnered with United Students Against Sweatshops on these various campuses, and they partnered with Barnes & Noble, which runs a lot of campus bookstores, to create this label. right? So that when students go in and buy logo wear for these 800 colleges, they know that it's being made in a humane way by union workers, under safe conditions. And so I think Villa Altagracia is really an example of something that could be scaled up, right? If a relatively small clothing manufacturer could make a profit doing it, and they've just started to make a profit, they had to go a few years without, then I think this is really a model that can be scaled up. And then I think another success is there are a couple of different kinds. One of these producers cooperatives all over the country and the world. I visited some grape co-ops in South Africa, where people are growing grapes in the townships. And I think for berries, there's a really interesting farm in California called the Swanton Berry Farm, which is both unionized and organic. And they are part of a project that tries to bring union organic grown produce for sale in poor districts of their state, right, for sale for affordable rates. Workers are paid in part in shares of the companies so that when they leave, they'll be able to retire. As a result, they stay on these berry farms for a really long time. And, it's one of the most stable workforces in agriculture. And so I think there are a lot of these kind of small successes that I think we need to look at. There are some zero-waste garment companies because fashion is a very dirty industry. There's a whole lot of going on that I think people should know about. And the final thing, maybe the biggest, is something called worker-led social responsibility codes. A lot of corporations have corporate social responsibility codes. They're worth only so much. But these worker-led codes that were pioneered by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, and that have come to turn the Florida tomato fields from the worst agricultural workplaces in the country to the very best, is now being used by Vermont dairy workers. They just got Ben & Jerry's to sign on. And what it is the big buyer at the top of the supply chain, Ben & Jerry's or Taco Bell, who buys the most tomatoes, or H&M, who buys the most clothes, they agree that they will pay a little bit more from their suppliers for a premium product, that this extra money will also help to pay for outside safety inspections, and to negotiate grievances around sexual assault and violence, and to fight labor slavery in these workplaces. This, to me, is one of the most promising new strategies, and I think it's taking over and is one way that we're going to see, really different kinds of conditions and wages around the world.
Well, and those are all of those are wonderful examples. And the one thing I think is really important to point out is that you just gave examples of both small companies and large corporations that can make this happen. So I think that's a very, very positive sign indeed. As we listen to Donald Trump, Annelise, talk about tearing up trade deals and imposing tariffs, what does that mean for low-wage workers?
I think that there is no question that trade agreements like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership had devastating effects on low-wage workers. I mean, what NAFTA did to small farmers in Mexico, as well as to American manufacturing workers, on the northern side of the border, was devastating. The thing is that the ways in which Donald Trump is going about, rethinking these trade deals has nothing to do with benefiting workers, right? These tariffs are, not thought through. They are, as is always the case with every economic policy that he comes up with, they're packaged to sound like they benefit workers when in fact they benefit corporations. I think if you really wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and there are all kinds of reasons that you should, for environmental disasters, for the preservation of, the diversity of corn crops in a state like Oaxaca in Mexico, which have been devastated by GMO American corn and as it flooded into the country after NAFTA. If you want to renegotiate, then you've got to put the right kinds of stakeholders at the table. It's not something you can just rattle off at the end of a press, at the end of a meeting with manufacturers in answer to a quickly asked question by the press. So do we need a new trade regime? Absolutely. But I think we need one that is not geared toward destroying organized labor. We need a vision much more like the Franklin Roosevelt vision, in which you had labor, manufacturers, and consumers together at the table. I'm not saying that regime was perfect by any stretch, but that's the kind of vision and structure that you would need to renegotiate the trade deals that have devastated our world in the last 30, 40 years. And I do agree that there's been tremendous damage as a result of the World Trade Organization tribunals and the loan policies and project policies of the World Bank and the IMF. There's no question about that. But Donald Trump's tariffs are not the answer.
Right. Well, and it's also, if fix it if it's broken. You don't necessarily have to throw out the entire thing. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College, author most recently of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, in another interview that you did on this book, you said this about the people you interviewed, quote, "They taught me that our inward-looking grief after the election of Donald Trump was a sign of our privilege, that we have to keep on fighting no matter what." Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed people who were, rising up and going into the streets, after Rodrigo Duterte was elected in the Philippines. The tremendous courage that it takes to go up against someone who, will shoot you as soon as look at you, really, really stunned me. And a lot of these are very young people, and one of them even said to me, we're too young. We can't afford to be afraid, right? This is, the movement is my life, she said. It's my music, it's my rhythm, and you can give me 1,000 reasons to leave it, and I will give you 1,000,000 why I have to stay on. I spoke to a 27-year-old activist and organizer of hotel and casino workers in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And, going up against the Hun Sen regime in Cambodia is no joke either, as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, and also a man very willing to use violence to preserve his hold on power. He has, and he will. And she said, I know I could die. I know I could die in this struggle. She said, but that's okay. She said, it really is. I'm not just saying that. It's really okay if I could begin to bring change. And another organizer there said to me, after the Phnom Penh, we deserve a real democracy, and we will put our lives on the line for it. So I think that in meeting with these workers, I think in watching the workers, the 50,000 or more who went on strike in Baja California, the berry pickers, some of the poorest workers in the world, and who shut down that Trans-Pacific Highway from Baja into California, where the berries get shipped into the United States. Their bravery is tremendous. Again, they're beaten by police, shot at, and I think that their insistence on continuing the struggle is a real lesson to all of us here in the United States. And I think also that African American and Latinx organizers here in the United States also, especially undocumented workers and organizers, really also put in perspective our grief about the Trump election. I spoke to a 21-year-old organizer and activist, an African American guy in Las Vegas, Stretch Sanders, who said to me, this was the day after the election. He said, I'm scared. But he said, I'm not that scared. My brothers and sisters were already being shut down in the streets by police who should know better. My undocumented coworkers were already having knocks on the door, and families were already being broken up with parents taken with their kids, didn't know where they could find them. He said, this struggle's been going on a long time, and we can't stop now. So all of those people gave me hope, and they gave me strength, and I just try to live up to their courage.
So you just mentioned hope, and you have said in the past this book left you with a feeling of hope. Why hope?
Well, because they've achieved a tremendous amount in a very short time. So for 40 years, wages have been stagnating, and in fact, the real buying power of wages has been dropping precipitously. But since 2012, workers just in the United States, low-wage workers, have through through passing local and state legislation, through getting private corporations to agree as a result of their protests to raise the minimum wage, have won $61.5 billion in wage raises in just 4 years, right? That is 12 times the raise that Congress gave low-wage workers the last time it raised the federal minimum wage in 2007. It went into effect in 2009. You've had wages have increased by many times all over the world, in South Africa, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in Mexico. So wage increases are happening, and the only reason they're happening is because of this vast organizing and the kinds of protests and the savvy use of social media to publicize these protests that these workers have made. I think it's really important to say that protesting in this day and age is very different than protesting was even 10, 12 years ago, right? Was something between 10 and 15 million people protested around the world before the start of the first Gulf War. The second Gulf War, 2003. But there was very little coverage of it, right? Now people publicize their own events, right? I've watched people post videos of protests onto social media and messages and download images of protests in other parts of the world. It's a new era. So all of this gives me hope, but I think also there's something about the poverty wages that so many people are laboring under today that's soul crushing, and the kinds of disrespect. I think it's really crucial that many of the organizations that I looked at are called Respect. In the Philippines, the Fast Food Workers Union is called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Alliance. The Walmart Workers Organization in this country is called Organization United for Respect at Walmart, our Walmart. I saw this again and again everywhere I went, and I think workers are giving themselves that respect. They're earning that respect by winning concessions. Some of them are huge. I mean, the fact that they won this huge increase in the minimum wage in the states of New York and California, the two biggest labor markets in the U.S., that's huge. Is it enough? By no means. As LaFonza Butler, who's one of the union organizers who was the co-chair of the Living Wage Campaign in L.A., said, nobody's going to Vegas on $15 an hour. It's $31,000 a year, even if you work full-time. But if you win it for yourself, you get a sense of respect and a sense of belief that you can bring change that fuels further action. And I think that's what gives me hope. There is change happening. It's not happening overnight. It's not enough yet, but change is happening, and it's potent and it's powerful. And even the Me Too movement, right? Long before we were hearing from Hollywood actresses, these workers around the world were campaigning for global UN resolutions and International Labor Organization conventions banning sexual violence in the workplace. That's amazing. And if they win it, it will change our world, and it will change individual lives in workplaces, from New York to Cape Town.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Great stuff. Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Professor, we appreciate your time with us, and we do and hope that you can join us again soon.
I hope so. I'd love to talk with you more. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how America's unions are fighting for single-payer health care. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
From the very start of our nation, the most popular forum for debating and shaping our democratic rights was not stately legislative halls, but rowdy beer halls. Indeed, pub democracy remains strong across our country, as is now being shown by a hardy group of democracy rebels in Toledo, Ohio. The people of this city on the edge of Lake Erie were literally sickened in 2014 when a toxic algae bloom poisoned the lake, which is their source of drinking water. People were outraged that state officials, who were in the pocket of the polluters, did nothing to protect the lake from more poisoning. Mulling this over while quaffing beers in a local pub, the rebels hit upon a novel thought. What if Lake Erie could protect itself by asserting its legal right to, quote, exist, flourish, and naturally evolve? Thus was born the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which the group proposed as a city charter ballot initiative. They got double the number of signatures required to put the proposition on February's ballot, mounted a door-to-door people's campaign to counter a media blitz partially funded by such giants as Coca-Cola and FedEx, and they won. A whopping 61% of Toledo's voters said yes to recognizing legally enforceable rights for the natural world. Supercilious corporate elites, however, refused to let such a trifling matter as the will of the people interfere with their sense of entitlement to poison for profit. So they've now gotten top Ohio officials to assert in a court filing that the state is the, quote, proprietor in trust of Lake Erie. Therefore, claim the officials, local voters have no power to deny so-called corporate persons the permission to pollute real people's water. This is Jim Hightower saying, of course, the democracy rebels are not about to back down, so keep up with them at www.lakeerieaction.org.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care believes that health care is a fundamental human right for everyone. In this encore interview, Mark Dudzic says it's up to unions to take the lead and fix our broken health care system. And we say hello to Mark Dudzic, a national coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care. Mark Dudzic, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Now, it may come as a surprise that there are some members in the labor movement that oppose a single-payer health care system, such as Medicare-for-All. What's the history here?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that have happened. The first is that because of sort of a unique failure in the 1940s to continue the New Deal, the American labor movement took to negotiating healthcare benefits and linking healthcare to employment, and was fairly successful in that for a number of years. And it was a real source of pride for unions if they were able to provide decent healthcare benefits for their members. And they talked about it as a real union advantage, and a sort of a culture grew up that celebrated and supported that kind of work within the labor movement. Now, that started to fray about a quarter century ago, to be honest, as the costs of healthcare became more and more unsustainable, and as employers started going head on after that. So what became a union advantage often now had become a real struggle and a difficult component of union bargaining, so that healthcare for the last couple of decades has been the biggest cause of strikes and lockouts and concession bargaining. So that has kind of moved. But the other dynamic I think that's happened is that often the labor movement, because it's a multi-issue organization, really doesn't want to get too far off message from the Democratic establishment. And so, when we had the Democratic presidential candidate in the last cycle telling people that we would never, ever have single payer, a lot of unions listened to that and felt that they should not really be seen as criticizing the candidate that they endorsed. So I think the dynamic has changed since that moment. Almost every candidate who is conceivably running for president has said that they support some kind of a version of Medicare-for-All, and that's opened up great new opportunities within the labor movement.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about private insurance. How is the private insurance industry, how is it failing American workers?
Well, let me count the ways. I mean, the private insurance industry, they have a flawed business model to begin with. They make money by denying people care. And, when you have that kind of situation that treats healthcare as a profit center rather than as a public good, you have all the kind of distortions that kind of profit-taking produces. So, we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world by almost 100% more than the average for advanced industrial country. And we, studies have shown that like a working class family of four that has decent employment coverage, that the total costs for that family exceed $28,000 per year. And employers pick up an average of $15,000, and the worker and their families kick in the other $13,000 or $14,000. And you can just see that becomes unsustainable. The amount that workers have paid for health care, the percentage that they've paid as opposed to the employer, has gone up every year since they started keeping track of this in 1984. So the private insurance industry is just shoveling more and more pain and liability onto the backs of most working families.
Mm-hmm. Now, unions, Mark, are often in the position of bargaining for better health care for their members, of course. What's the impact of that on a sense of solidarity with unions?
Yeah, well, that's really the point of contact that a lot of people have with the issue of healthcare justice is, when they're in that bargaining cycle and they're facing the demands that almost every employer brings to the table nowadays to cut benefits and narrow networks and increase co-pays and deductibles and co-insurance. That's an opportunity to both engage with our members on this and to engage with the wider working class movements that are struggling for healthcare justice. So, the smart unions will frame those fights as fights for healthcare for all and use it both to educate their members on the ground and also to reach out into the community and say that we're fighting not only for the healthcare benefits that we fought so long to win, but we're fighting to expand healthcare to everybody, regardless of their employment status and their union membership.
We're speaking with Mark Dudzic. He's National Coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care. Mark, let's talk more about your organization, the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Health Care, and what you hope to achieve.
Yeah, so we launched this project in January of 2009, which was right before the first inauguration of President Obama. It was a very different time, a very hopeful time in a lot of ways. And we launched it because we knew that the political debate was going to be wide open around where to go on healthcare policy, what the future of healthcare was. And we wanted to sort of weigh in, make sure that there was a voice that demanded that single payer be put on the table in those debates and discussions. And so we started with a small group of national unions and a couple of dozen local and regional union organizations around the country who were really committed to pushing this and pushing the labor movement to take the lead in this fight. And, over the years, we've been able to build this out. There's now 14 national unions who are affiliated with our project, a couple hundred regional unions, local unions around the country, including some statewide labor federations. And, the AFL-CIO has taken positions in support of the goal of single-payer Medicare-for-All at the last two conventions. So we've really become a real powerful pole within the labor movement that says that we have to organize and commit resources and political muscle to this fight for healthcare justice.
And, if the labor movement fully backed single-payer healthcare, what kind of difference could that make in the debate?
That would be a game changer. If the labor movement put the kind of resources into this fight that they can still put in, even in our weakened state, that they can still put in into existential fights, we would be, much further along on this fight if they, made this one of their top 2 or 3 issues for lobbying, if they educated and mobilized their members, as some unions are doing today, if they use their political relationships locally and nationally, we could really begin to move this much more aggressively in the body politic.
It seems like it would be, obviously it's, numbers, big numbers. The more people you have, the more success you have. So is there a sense of, perhaps from your organization, of creating sort of a snowball effect and getting more and more of labor movement to fully back the single-payer healthcare?
Yeah, I think we're right at that moment. We see it, it's entering the general political dialogue. Union members now, hear and discuss and think about these things much more than they did 10 years ago when we launched this project. So, in many ways, we've won the battle of ideas. So now it's really the question of, implementing a real effective strategy that mobilizes us at the grassroots and can move this campaign forward. So we've really, we're really at a crucial moment, and not just within labor. This sort of reflects a much broader social movement that's emerged that sees Medicare-for-All as sort of the wedge issue of a broader transformational politics that people are beginning to embrace. It's a real funny time politically right now. We have these huge challenges with this out of control Trump administration that's trying to push us back into the 19th century. But on the other hand, on the ground, we have all of this ferment of people, working towards a much better world, and a world that treats things like healthcare as a public good and not a commodity. And I'm actually very hopeful that we can move forward in these times.
Well, and you're working with a lot of organizations. Who are some of your allies in this fight?
Okay, well, within the labor movement, I have to say that organizations, unions that represent nurses are the leading lights in our movement. Nurses really get this issue. They're passionate about the desire to create a system that serves the needs of their patients, and they see all of the flaws in the current system. So the National Nurses United, which is the largest national nurses union, is head and shoulders above any other labor organization in this fight, and a number of other nurses unions, like the New York State Nurses Association, and the AFT nurses in Vermont. A number of other nurses unions are really active in this fight. So that's really, and they help transform labor with us. And then there's other organizations on the ground. Healthcare Now is an organization that's been doing community-based organizing and agitating for a number of years, and we really consider them to be our sister organization. Some of the newer progressive organizations have been really consistent on taking this issue up. The Progressive Democrats of America have been with us from the date that they were launched, as has Our Revolution, and some of the longer-term social movement organizations like People's Action and Campaign for Popular Democracy and Public Citizen have also begun to move this into the center of their political and organizing agendas. So we're building some real momentum and building a broad coalition of social movement and labor organizations.
Well, let's keep that snowball growing. That's all I've got to say. Mark Dudzic, National Coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single-Payer Healthcare, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Mark, thank you so much for your time with us, and we do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Love to be back.
Thank you very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press asks former Trump aide Anthony Scaramucci about why he is fighting to make sure the president doesn't win a second term.
Let me ask you first, Donald Trump just left the G7 summit in the south of France. I'm sure you watched it from afar like we all did. How do you think he did on the world stage?
Well, listen, it was obviously very embarrassing. It's painful to say that as a fellow American. I'm also traveling overseas. So, one of the things you hate doing is commenting about the American president overseas. But, since you guys are domestic guys, I'll tell you that he looked out of it. The press conference was a disaster. He was basically saying that Melania had met Chairman Kim, Stephanie Winston, his press secretary and comms director, had to walk it back. He's dissembling. He clearly lied this morning. He was probably in a full-blown panic over the stock market cratering. The overnight market was down a lot, 300-400 points. He gets to the podium during the Egyptian thing and lies blatantly and says that something happened with the Chinese, which in fact did not happen. And then I'll just point out three other quick things. Number one, they bring the Iranian foreign minister there. They don't tell him, completely embarrass him on that.
Yep.
That's our longest standing ally. Number two, they more or less leave him out of all of the major conversations. And then he decides to leave himself out of the climate change one. So America first for President Donald Trump is America alone. And so, listen, this is not personal for me. I like the president. I obviously put my own personal money into his campaign. I supported him. But people have asked me, when would the red line be? And we've crossed now into that red line territory. So I wrote an op-ed last week describing the things that I broke from him on. And then once he went full-blown racist tropes, it was like, okay, this guy's going to set off a metastatic cancer inside the society. So we're in a very dangerous territory. I'm shocked personally that elected leadership in the United States is not doing anything. And if your listeners care about the country, call your elected leaders and say, excuse me, what are you doing exactly about this? Are we going to remove him from office? Are we going to at least get him a psychiatric evaluation at Walter Reed Hospital? Something. It is the United States, and this is the age of full-blown media. He is literally having a nervous breakdown on the world stage.
Why do you think it is that so many of these Republicans in the Senate, particularly, and in the House, are afraid to take on Donald Trump? It's almost like, do you think it's sort of like a cult relationship that they've got with him?
Well, listen, when you say it's a cult relationship, what happens is the people that are in the cult relationship get very offended. So I've been trying not to say that, frankly, but the truth of the matter is he is a full-on bully and he's a full-on demagogue. And so when you're a full-on demagogue, what ends up happening is you can't accept one syllable or one paragraph of disagreement. So if I agree at 9 out of 12 things that I wrote in my op-ed, he's going to light me up on his Twitter feed. Lighting me up isn't enough. He's going to then viciously attack my wife, who has nothing to do with the political process and is literally a suburban housewife at home taking care of 2 young children. So, I mean, this is a despicable train wreck of a human being. So when Ted Cruz called him a sniveling coward, what I'm upset about is I didn't fully see it from Ted Cruz's vantage point until he did it to my wife, and that's something I have to hold myself accountable for. I should have been speaking out about this earlier, but listen, I am here now, and now we have to figure out a way of creating an off-ramp for my fellow 2016 Trump supporters. We've got to see if we can convince these people how blatantly un-American Donald Trump is. I mean, there's nothing more un-American than bullying. And this guy is a bully, and he's got those people scared out of their minds related to him. He's also got them convinced that he won some sort of landslide because he's lying about the support in the Republican Party. His support is high. It's down to 78%. It's continuing to shrink. His overall approval rating is 36%. And so at some point, because politicians are more self-interested than they are caring about people or serving people, they'll figure out that they're vulnerable and then they'll turn on them. But I would love to see 1 or 2 of them have the confidence to turn on him now. You'll withstand his Twitter onslaught. It's not even that big of a deal.
I want to ask you, I want to get to some of these people that you're talking to and they might take him on, but back for just a second to your own situation. Was there for you because, look, I read your first book or your last book where you still say some nice things about Donald Trump. And I've also read your recent op-ed and seen you on CNN. Clearly, you've broken with Donald Trump now. Was there a tipping point for you where it just said, all right, this is it. I can't be with this guy any longer?
Well, first of all, the book, the president didn't like the book because if you read through the book, you'll find out it was a very balanced assessment of him.
Yeah.
Where I did praise him was that he was advocating for blue collar workers. And I said that those people, unfortunately, have had no advocacy in Washington. Establishment politicians on the left and right have not advocated for them in over 3 decades. And so for that, he deserved credit. And he still deserves credit. I'm not, a Trump derangement syndrome person. I'm trying to be as balanced as possible. But what I said in the op-ed is I broke from him on the child separation issue. I broke from him on the denunciation of our intelligence agencies while he was praising Vladimir Putin. I wrote an op-ed, you can find it on thehill.com, about the press. I said, Mr. President, the press is not the enemy of the people. And I explained why the press itself is not the enemy of the people. And I think the last straw for me, the tipping point, was the racist stuff. I mean, it's just full-on racism and using a racist trope to tell people to go back to the country that they came from. In the meantime, 3 of those people were born in the United States. 1 is a naturalized citizen, and all 4 are democratically elected congresswomen of the United States. So, I don't know what you're talking about. And they said that stuff to my grandmother 100 years ago. So for me, the combination of that plus the fact that he started to attack me on Twitter, which is a sign that he's a full-blown demagogue. It's almost as if Roy Cohn had a baby with Joe McCarthy and they made Donald Trump together, and he's out there running the country into the ground. So for me, that's the combination of things. But it's not like I woke up one morning and a rock hit me in the head and I changed. I just said, hey, there's just too many things he's doing now. It's impossible to support him. And I don't know about you guys. I mean, he's, most of my liberal friends say that he's been nuts the whole time. But I think he's gotten progressively and more steeply sloping downward into nuttier and nuttier stuff over the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Are you sorry you went to work for him?
Absolutely not. No, I'm not sorry at all. I mean, he's the American president. He asked me to do a job. As I pointed out, unfortunately, he was really just looking for me to be a hatchet man. But I'm happy to have served in the White House and served in the government. I mean, I've lived this very, very improbable life where I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood with parents that didn't go to college. I got myself into 2 reasonably good schools, and then I went on and built some successful businesses. And so whether it was 1 day, 1 hour, 11 days, I still consider it an honor to serve inside the White House in the United States government. It's just unfortunate that, this guy's like a full-blown narcissist, won't take anybody's counsel, doesn't like anybody getting attention other than himself. And he's now descending the world into his own personal Hades. So, we have to do our best to try to stop that.
When you were working with him in the White House, did you ever tell him, hey, that's wrong, you're wrong, or that's a bad idea?
Yeah, no question. No question. And by the way,
who does that? Who does that today?
That was the point I made to Anderson Cooper a week ago. John Kelly, who obviously fired me, so we started off a rough relationship, but we have a very good one now. When he left the White House and he served for White House Chief of Staff for about 18 months, I mean, the thing started really coming off the rails. I think John, being a 4-star general and having a presence about him and a leadership presence about him, was able to say no to the president or to help the president co-opt some of the worst tendencies of his behavior. There is nobody there now doing that.
Nobody. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Not that I see it at any rate. So on CNN and in the Washington Post, you have talked about talking to people about a primary challenge to Donald Trump. What are you're talking about, but what are you doing about it? Are you raising money? Are you talking to people? Do you have an organization? What are you doing?
Yeah, listen, I made that presentation a week ago. I'm in the process right now of organizing a PAC. Unfortunately, the paperwork for that takes a little bit. I would assume the Tuesday or Wednesday after Labor Day, I'll have the PAC formed and named. I'm going out to a large group of people and getting some signatures of American Republican CEOs that don't want anything to do with Donald J. Trump, that really see the party has moved into a personality cult as opposed to the party of Abraham Lincoln and Dwight Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan. And so there's a very large group of people that would like to find a safe haven in another Republican entity. And so I'm in the process of putting that together. And I think that there will be a very large group of those people because, being affiliated and associated with Donald Trump, very bad for business. 62% of the American people hate his guts, at least 80% of the world. And so when you just do the math, being in the tank or supporting him publicly, just not good for business. And so there's a lot of Republicans that would like to move away from him, but they would still like to stay in the Republican Party if possible.
Right. So, the old saying, you can't beat somebody with nobody. You need a candidate. Who's your candidate?
Well, what I'm hoping is we'll have 2 or 3 more people enter the race. Bill Weld and Joe Walsh are in the race now. I've met Bill a few times. I've never met Joe. And Bill's a great guy. I'm hoping that we can get 1 or 2 of the potential 2024 candidates. I think the conventional wisdom was the economy's strong. He's got a high approval rating with the Republicans. No way to challenge him. I think if you don't challenge him, I don't see how you have standing in 2024. I don't see how you can get to the podium in 2024 and say, hey, I'm running for president, but I walked by and whistled past the Trump graveyard over the last 4 years. Or what did I do in 2020 to try to stop this monster? And so I think that these people hopefully will come to their senses and challenge him. But I do think you need an experienced politician to do that. I think that I could be wrong about this, but you got to have somebody with some experience to run this process.
Right. Are you talking directly to Jeff Flake through me?
What do you mean?
Would he be someone that you would see that should step up?
No, I have not spoken to Jeff. I don't know where Jeff's head's at on this, but Jeff, again, I don't know him, but he probably thought a month, 2 or 3 ago that this wouldn't be a possibility. I think that would certainly be a possibility at this point. Somebody like Jeff Flake. I mean, he's a very talented guy, and he's been outspoken about how nutty the president is. And now, as the president's gotten nuttier and nuttier, he would be an acceptable replacement.
I'm sure you know. I don't know whether you know George Conway. You know who he is.
Yeah, certainly. Very well. No, George and I are close.
Good. George said this morning, or tweeted out this morning, that if Justin Amash, the Republican congressman from Michigan, were to step forward, Conway would be in his camp in a moment. Would you?
Yeah. Well, I don't know Justin, but what I've said to everybody generically, yes. I think we've got to get at least 3 or 4 people in there. If you go back to the 1968 situation, Lyndon Johnson, whatever you thought of him, was tearing up the fabric of America, a result of which, the people in his party thought we needed a re-engineered leadership change. And so once you got 3 or 4 people in there litigating over how badly he was doing, his poll numbers continued to drop. And then by March of 1968, he came out. Now, Bill Kristol pointed out yesterday that Lyndon Johnson's poll numbers, his approval rating, was actually higher than Donald J. Trump's approval rating on August 25th. On August 25th, 1967, Lyndon Johnson had a higher approval rating than Donald J. Trump does right now. So to me, if you can get 3 or 4 players in there, I think that would be a great thing for the country. That would knock the president's approval ratings into the low 20s, the low 30s, high 20s, and then I think we've got a ball game. So yes, I would certainly welcome him into the race, and I would do whatever I could to help fortify the advocacy for him and others, and so that there could be an open debate about where to go.
Bill Press talking with Anthony Scaramucci. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Annelise Orleck, Mark Dudzic, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.